Hello and assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome back to the second panel of the 2024 LSE Future of Pakistan conference titled Pakistan's Economic Growth Agenda, The Way Forward. Before I introduce the panel, I'd like to invite our academic chair, Adil Malik, to make her opening remarks.
Thank you so much. My name is Dr. Ali Stot. I'm an assistant professor here in the government department, and today I'm just here to make sure that we are upholding the LSE freedom of speech rules and regulations. Thank you.
Thank you, Elise. In the face of persistent political upheaval, Pakistan's economic policies become subject to the electoral whims of its political leaders. With inflation rates bordering 30% and yet another narrow escape from default, this year's developments have been in stark contrast to the emerging Pakistan vision championed by political stakeholders. The World Bank has raised the country's human capital crisis, taxation structure, economic openness, agricultural evolution, and energy sector inefficiencies as key policy areas requiring urgent attention in 2024. To deliberate on Pakistan's pathway to sustainable economic growth, today's panel is comprised of a diverse range of economic perspectives. Our first speaker today is Professor Adil Malik. Professor Malik serves as an associate professor in development economics at the University of Oxford's Department of International Development. He is also the Globe Fellow in Economies of Muslim Societies at the Oxford Centre of Islamic Studies and a Senior Research Fellow at Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford. Professor Malik has conducted extensive empirical research on economic fluctuations, political economy, and the role of institutions in development programs. Prior to joining Oxford, Professor Malik held several policy and research appointments at research institutes across the globe, including Harvard University and the World Bank. Professor Malik holds a DPhil in economics from Oxford University, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar in 2004, and he also holds a graduate degree from the University of Oxford. Our second speaker for today is Mr. Hamza Javed. Hamza is the co-founder of Bazar Technologies, Pakistan's largest B2B commerce platform, serving over 200 SMEs through its suite of digital products. In less than 4 years of founding, Bazar is Pakistan's leading technology startup, having raised over $100 million from top global venture capitalists and employing over 2,500 people in the country. Bazar's growth story was recently featured as a case study at Harvard Business School. Bazar is also the recipient of the Prime Minister's Award as a leading tech company. Prior to starting Bazar, Hamza was a consultant at McKinsey & Company in Dubai and is also an LSE alumnus, having completed his undergraduate degree at the school in 2015. So welcome back to Hamza. Today's panel will be moderated by Ahmed Norez Rana. Norez is an economist with the World Bank Group in Washington, D.C., working on the design and implementation of business and investment climate reforms targeted towards poverty reduction and business-led growth. Previously, he has worked with the International Finance Corporation and UNDP on areas of private sector development focusing on employment, entrepreneurship, and market creation, with an emphasis on gender mainstreaming and digitalization. Norez holds a dual degree master's in economic development and public policy from Columbia University and the London School of Economics, so welcome back again. And he also holds a bachelor's in economics and finance from the University of Waterloo. Thank you to all of our speakers, as well as Mr. Zubair Umar, who will be returning for this panel after joining us in the earlier panel this morning. Before we begin the session, I would like to take the opportunity to highlight specific rules and regulations which are in effect throughout the duration of the event. First and foremost, no sharp objects, nationalistic and political symbols, such as flags and banners, are allowed inside the venue. If these are found to be in your possession, they will be confiscated from you. Furthermore, no photography or audio-video recordings of any sort are allowed inside the venue. Additionally, no liquid or food is allowed inside the venue. Lastly, we reserve the right to refuse entry to anyone that we may consider a security threat or may otherwise attempt to derail proceedings today. With that out of the way, let us begin today's session. Norez, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Myra. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this session on Pakistan Economic Growth Agenda. We have a stellar list of panelists over here, and they represent a diverse group of representation ranging from the private sector to the academia, and then Mr. Zubair, who was the Minister of Privatization. So we also have representation from the government. And through that, we'll be able to cover a more holistic understanding of what the key issues are. And before we talk about what are the various avenues and channels to realizing success on the economic front, it's very important, I must say, to understand and be aware of what the key issues are. Because you'll only be able to find the solution if you know what the true roots from where the problems erupt from. The last 2 years have been economically quite tumultuous for Pakistan. We experienced quite high rates of inflation going up as high as almost 39%, which according to certain estimates has been understated. So according to some experts, analysts and economists, Pakistan's actual rate of inflation may have even surpassed 50%. And in certain areas such as food, commodity prices, they were much larger. The country over the last course of year and a half or two suffered quite some challenges in unlocking finance, both internationally and domestically. We quite intimately flirted with the possibility of default. Exactly a year from today, in January 2023, our foreign reserves were dwindling at $3.1 billion. And that is glaringly low, given that it only provides an import cover for 2 weeks. The issues that led to us reaching that scenario is multitude. There has been a balance of payment crisis, there have been fiscal deficits, there have been trade deficits, and all of those have contributed to very high levels of unsustainable debt. Currently, our external debt is about $128 billion. 5 years ago, when the last time when the elections happened in 2018, our external debt was about $93 billion. And if you go 5 years even prior to that, in 2013, when the PMN government came to power, the external debt was $61 billion. So over the course of the last 10 years, our external debt has doubled, increased by over 100%. And if you throw internal debt into the mix, currently our total debt stands at $234 billion, and it's projected to go up to 409 by 2028. Now, I just want you all to kind of realize that and visualize how big that number is for a country who's been negotiating with the IMF for loans as little as $1 billion. Every now and then there's a new tranche that's about to be released, $700 million, and we eagerly await that. So now coping up with something that is estimated to grow to $409 billion is a huge pressing concern. And it's not just about debt. When we are referring to debt, you have to, there are interest payments that you have to return, and that crowds out the space for actual development funds that can be allocated to things which are the drivers or engine of economic growth. Health, education, infrastructure, so many other things. But we are grappling with the levels of debt that are likely to exceed 100% of our GDP. Now, my very first question would be to the former Minister of Privatization, Mr. Zubair Umar. And I would like to ask him that debt, while is a problem, I view it as kind of a symptom. It's a symptomatic indication of various structural deficiencies that lay within the system and that have evolved over the years. Why and how did we get to where we are?
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I think it has been building up, and it was anyone back in 2010, for example, or even earlier, knew that the fundamentals are not correct. And what is the fundamental? First, the gap between our expenditure and the revenue growth. The revenue growth has been very limited compared to the expenditure. That has led to unsustainable fiscal deficit. And just to give numbers in terms of that, we have obviously continuously promised something like 4 or 5% as a percentage of GDP. But in absolute numbers, if I am not wrong, back in 2018, the fiscal deficit was had touched rupees 2 trillion, or just close to 2 trillion. Okay, this year it's going to be about 9 trillion. So you can see the magnitude, how fast, and the speed with which it is growing. The same is about the current account deficit or the trade deficit, because our exports, the sources from which we can earn foreign exchange are much limited compared to our needs for imports, and imports are required for economic growth, because if you restrict imports, then obviously you are restricting growth, which then converts into unemployment, lower taxation, and all of those things. In my view, obviously debt is a serious crisis. Only this year, just to have a sense of the magnitude of the problem, this year interest payment, just the interest payment, is going to be 8.5 trillion rupees. And a total net revenue, which is net revenue is after the center has given share to the provinces, we will be left with borrowing just after debt repayment. We will need to borrow more debt. And with the policy rate at 22%, you can see the impact of that, how fast it is going to grow. So, I mean, nothing in terms of the major system is there. Now, why is revenue growth so slow? We have been pondering around 10% as tax as a percentage of GDP, which is obviously unsustainable, and which, when you compare with even a country like India, which is about 18%, so see the difference. I mean, at the same rate that India's tax to GDP is, if Pakistan has the same tax to GDP, then it will be double than what we are, almost double in terms of the absolute numbers and how much we can do and how much less fiscal deficit we will have and less need for borrowing and so on and so forth. The governments are mainly responsible, and each successive government is responsible, because the easy way out is, and it has multiple other problems, like for example today, 75% of the lending, 75% of the lending or 80% from the commercial banks is to the government because of its deficit situation, which crowds out the private sector actually. First, it can't sustain the high interest rates. 22% is the policy rate. The actual rate for the businesses to borrow would be around 24, 25, 26%. First, it is too high. Second, it just crowds out the private sector, even if they are able to sustain that high markup rates. So that's the other fundamental problem, and that obviously leads to less investment, and less investment leads to less employment opportunities and so on. On the external front, if I am not wrong, I think some of my colleagues here will confirm that since 1988, if I am not wrong, Pakistan has had 14 balance of payment serious crises. And that each balance of payment crisis means that you have to go to some institution, and now to IMF first, because IMF has become the benchmark for all other institutions, whether you're talking about global financial institutions or even the friendly countries, that they want to see whether IMF is on board with us. And because of the fact that we have had so many balance of payment crises, 23 IMF loans we have had since the early 60s or mid-50s maybe. And that's a world record. It means there is a problem. And as you would understand, IMF is supposed to be a one-time prescription, as India went to IMF in 1991, first time when it was opening up its economy and they wanted to do market reforms, and then Manmohan Singh, who was the finance minister, and this is interesting because he realized the gravity of the economic situation, so he walks up to Nareshma Rao, who was the Prime Minister then, and tells him that India is in big trouble. And unless we do something dramatically different from what we have been doing since 1947, India is not sustainable. And as the good Prime Minister, he says, what do we need to do? He said, we have to undertake serious market reforms. And he did let Manmohan Singh, the finance minister, to okay. And for the first and the last time, they went to IMF. And interestingly, as Manmohan Singh writes, that he turns back and goes back to the office of the Prime Minister, tells him that the Prime Minister, that the reforms that we will undertake will be so dramatic, so drastic, will be so painful for the people that we are almost going to lose the next elections, which they did lose the elections. But even today, even if you ask the other party, because this was Congress party, the BJP party credits India's phenomenal rise after that to those actions that the Congress party leadership had taken. So those are the kind of reforms that Pakistan needs to do. And for that, we need to have political stability. And political stability means that any political party which wins, it's a separate subject whether we are going to have credible elections. I think we discussed that in the first session, unless someone wants to discuss that. But it's a 5-year mandate. And a 5-year mandate means that if you are convinced, as the Prime Minister and as the Cabinet and members of the ruling party, if you are convinced that we will truly have 5 years with the decision making with us, so you understand the gaps that exist today, where we are today, how we have reached this situation, is unsustainable, that the process should continue. And one area that I think Pakistani policymakers and governments have consistently ignored and been indifferent is the reality that apart from the economic indicators, which is extremely important to address, the one area which is totally ignored are the social indicators or the human development indicators. If you don't fix that, you can't have sustainable economic growth. As you mentioned, UN has called for emergency as far as education and health areas are concerned. And why is it important? You need a healthy, educated people to contribute to the economic growth of the country. If you have, I'm not sure Pakistan has the largest or second largest, but even if it's the second largest out of school children in the world, kids below the age of 40% are stunted. So you can imagine deformed people growing up. The kind of population growth that Pakistan has is 2.55% compared to 0.7 with India and 1% of Bangladesh. So it's unsustainable. Similarly, women empowerment, the fairness of the judicial system, minority rights, you fix those things on a permanent basis. Obviously you can't just produce educated people coming out of schools and colleges and universities immediately, but because it's a sustained thing. But the start has to be made and a recognition that these fundamentals have to be fixed for you to have permanent or sustainable economic growth.
Thank you, Zubair Sahib. You highlighted some very key points. And it goes without saying that economy by itself is nothing. It is contingent upon political stability. You need to have firmness in your constitutional environment. The digital environment, such as the landscape, is more conducive for investment. And the political economy is a key factor, and we'll come to it. And Dr. Adil Malik is an expert on political economy. But before we touch upon these things, there were other things that you mentioned in your address right now, where you mentioned that Pakistan tends to import a lot, Pakistan tends to import a lot, which has been the crux of our trade deficits and our balance of payment crisis. And it is rightly so that over the years, as the world opened up and people moved from closed economies to open economies, we went on to become a more import-oriented, consumption-driven economy. And largely it has got to do with the fact that internally we haven't really developed our productive capabilities, or we haven't made enhancements on that end. The government has, to some degree, I would say, failed to really prop up the private sector by providing them with the right set of de jure and de facto environment, creating that enabling environment which is more receptive to investment. There are various lackings that we tend to suffer with and we tend to incur. And on that note, I really want to bring Hamza in the discussion. He was able to raise quite an extensive amount to his Series A and Series B funding and set up an expansive operational enterprise in Pakistan by the name of Bazar Technologies. On that end, Hamza, what were some of the key challenges that you faced in working with the government or in setting it up, the de jure environment related to licensing, permitting processes, or dispute resolutions, things like that, which can enable or at the same time kind of disincentivize businesses from registering, or if they've registered, growing up? Because you need a system that is effective, that is efficient, and the role of the government should only be that of the facilitator. Because right now in the world, you look at any developing or developed country, 9 out of 10 jobs are being created by the private sector. It's not the government's job to provide you with employment. That's where the private sector comes in. So here the floor is yours to highlight again some of the challenges that you experienced.
Thank you, Naresh. I think just for context, let me explain what our journey has been. So we founded the company in 2020, and that was an era of the tech investments globally, and tech investments in Pakistan naturally as well, really shot up. So we went from 2019 to 2020 5 times in terms of VC investments in Pakistan, and most of the capital came from outside, mostly hedge funds, large venture capitalists who fund every country in the world, also started coming into Pakistan. 2021 was an even better year, and 2022 we started seeing some corrections. And 2023 was still better than 2019, but we took a nosedive both as a result of the political instability in Pakistan as well as the tech downturn that we saw globally as well. But before all of that, you talked about the challenges we faced when we started up the business. To be honest, I am a glass half full guy. Wherever there was government, there was a problem. But largely the government stays away. it's just the largesse of the government that starts to hamper the private sector. Whenever government comes in, whether it's a labor department or the tax department or any other department, there are about 34 departments that the company, our company deals with on a monthly basis in terms of licensing, fees, regulation, etc. And we're the most compliant company because we are funded by international investors. We just cannot cut any corners. And even then, wherever the government comes in, there is a problem. However, at the same time, over the past 3-4 years, there has been a significant improvement, and the conduciveness to technology sector in Pakistan is increasing rapidly. I say that despite all of the stuff that's happening politically and economically, there is and I'm 30 years old, I represent the 40th percentile. 60 median age of Pakistan is 23. So I represent more than 50% of the people that live in the country and do not take part in the political, economic, news debate. And they're very, very, they're on TikTok and YouTube, and they're not on Geo News, right? So you can see where the paradigm shift is happening. They prefer not to work at HBL or sell shampoos. They want to work at a technology company. They want to be a software engineer. And in that segment, there is a massive paradigm shift happening in Pakistan. Over just the last year, in 2023, the growth of the mobile money or the digital payment sector in Pakistan was 70% in terms of number of transactions. This is despite the politics, this is despite the economy. There's a rapid digitization that's happening in the country. We have more internet users in Pakistan than the entire population of UK. And so all what we need is the government to stay away and the government to just, puts its house in order. Just, there should not be any noise that affects the private sector. If you just let that happen, the businesses will be fine. There is immense opportunity. Just the fashion sector in Pakistan is about $36 billion. If you just put that in e-commerce terms, that's a huge market. Pakistani venture capital today is about $2 per capita, or $1.50 per capita, and the best year we had was 2021. India today, after all the tech downturn, is $19. So there's a huge potential in terms of bringing it into investment, and all what you need is a 25-year-old, a NUS graduate or a GIK graduate with a laptop, and he can generate between $30,000 to $40,000 of GDP per annum. They don't need gas, they don't need electricity, they don't need land, they don't need tax reform, they don't need subsidies, they don't need anything. They just need to learn how to write code and then sell software to a company in the US. And because of labor arbitrage, there's a huge potential. So all of that stuff is happening. Despite all of that, December 2023 was the best year Pakistan had in terms of IT services export. Why? Because the labor arbitrage after devaluation has increased so much that if you live in Karachi, you're the cheapest software engineer anybody can hire anywhere in the world. And those are the fundamentals of our country that I am super, super optimistic by. It was this country 3 years ago when my company, on just a PowerPoint deck, raised about $1.5 million. And over the past 4 years, we raised $100 million of outside capital, despite all of the stuff that we have in the country. So we suffer from, I think, just the cyclicality of politics and economics. Agar sirf 2-3 saal hame mil jaye, just stability, the market is extremely large, because when you look at all of these risky investment agents, the market in India, UK, US are starting to saturate when it comes to technology. But when you look at logistics, e-commerce, financial services, healthcare, education, Pakistan remains a completely untapped country, and there's a lot more to do. And my message would be to all of us here who always think about going back to Pakistan, I would say, is sabko bhul jaye jo kuch ho raha hai. Just come and start a company. And you will see the potential and opportunity there, and you will also get funding from outside. And Pakistan also suffers from a brand problem. I think चीज़ें हमें यहाँ बैठ के लगता है बहुत बुरी हैं, इतनी बुरी नहीं जितने यहाँ brand बना हुआ है. Because I'm there. I was the one who studied in this university, worked abroad for 5 years, and then moved back and started a company. And every single day of my company is as fulfilling as it could be in Pakistan versus anywhere outside. So I think there's a lot of doom and gloom, but I represent the optimism. And there is a lot of optimism also to be had.
Rightly so. I think thank you for sharing that optimism, and I hope that it tends to permeate through various other sectors of the economy as well. But I feel that we all can agree that tech and the digital sector is somewhat of an outlier, because if we look at other traditional sectors that Pakistan has been associated with, there are a lot of market failures that tend to overpower the true market functionalities of how an economy should tend to function. And it's got to do a lot of the incentive mechanisms that have been laid out. There's a lot of incentive towards unproductive sectors such as the real estate, where if you want to invest, you barely have to pay 0 to 1% on taxation. Otherwise, if you're setting up a corporate entity, the taxes can go up as 29 to 30%. So that inherently tends to, disincentivize and demotivate, the youth who want to pursue entrepreneurial activities, in certain sectors. And speaking of incentive, it's very closely tied to the political economy. And here I would want to bring in Dr. Adil Malik, because Pakistan is again going through a transformation. There's political instability. There's a lot of polarization, even among the people, not just among the political parties as well. And in such an environment, how do you spur not just the tech sector, but other traditional sectors? How do you make it more conducive for investment to come in? How do you kind of enforce that trust, with the people of the country? And on that note, sir, what are the political economy dynamics, and what does true economic reform really entail through that particular lens?
Thank you very much for this kind invitation to participate. I would like to first respond or sort of connect with the two panelists. Mr. Zubair started with a set of problems that Pakistan has at the moment. And when I was studying as an undergraduate in Pakistan, exactly the same sort of issues were coming up, and now they've just intensified. And when we talk about the potential of the country, absolutely, this massive potential. And this is true globally. Like, as a development economist, I remember when I first traveled to Algeria, and when you land in Algiers, you realize it's kind of 1,500 kilometers of coastline right next to Europe. That the place could just be the manufacturing hub of the Mediterranean. Yet it's part of a system of authoritarian power structure that keeps the potential low. And for that, you have to go back to political economy. There's a great paper that Daron Acemoglu wrote, which is called Economic Backwardness in a Political Perspective. And it made the important argument that political elites know exactly where the growth potential lies, but they would obstruct growth in part because they don't want to disrupt the prevailing political order. In technology, obviously, the state realizes that you could create a lot of growth without disrupting the political status quo. And so that's good for IT in a way, and I hope that the IT sector becomes the sort of constituency that could push for more reforms. But one reason reforms don't happen is because of what we call in political economy, sorry, I'm still in that tutorial mode, it's called the commitment challenge. And the commitment challenge is a challenge that's everywhere. Wherever in the world you've looked at fiscal crises, they have political roots. You think about Lebanon has, a fiscal Ponzi scheme. You think about what's happening in Egypt at the moment. Very similar circumstances, right? Debt is exploding, the interest payments are growing, they're outstripping other kinds of expenditures. But the system doesn't permit. Why? Because the economic reform that is required to stabilize will be hurtful for those who are in power. That's the commitment challenge, right? So the two things that you require for a state is monopoly of violence. This is again textbook thing, monopoly of violence and ability to extract taxes in an equitable and fair manner. Now in Pakistan, you have a real problem of economic viability of the model that we are pursuing. Right? And this has become quite apparent since the 1980s. We are struggling with fiscal deficits, we are struggling with current account deficits, both are interlinked. And as Mr. Zubair argued, the fiscal crisis is very simple. Just as the IMF did multiple reports, many of them are blue book reports, secret reports, they were issued later on. We know exactly, even from this university, Mr. Sham Ahmed, who's one of the best global experts on taxation, wrote a report for tax reform. And technology is available. Nadra tried to fix that, right? To provide an example where you could use digitization to implement tax reform. But again, there is commitment challenge, because if you are going to tax, have a tax reform, you have to tax the agricultural sector, and much of the landed aristocracy is in the parliament, they would oppose it. You will have to tax the real estate sector, the military is into the real estate sector, and many other big actors, they would resist that. If you want to tax traders, the politicians, Nawaz Sharif would not like to have taxation of the traders. And so you need to revise the social contract. You need to recognize that to pursue this model, you would need to do two things. One, you have to constantly pass on taxes to the poor and to the productive classes, those who are setting up businesses, those who are so you're constantly passing on more taxes to them. So the tax burden will be passed on to the poor and the productive classes. So the poor are subsidizing the rich that way. Second, you have to take debt from international markets, and to take debt for a geopolitically significant state like Pakistan, you have to forfeit your sovereignty. You have to part of a big geopolitical project every few years to sustain yourself. Now, in all of these situations, obviously, and in fact, that's the fiscal side. The current account side, I wrote recently a paper, it's called Obfuscated Liberalization, How Special Interest Groups Capture Trade Liberalization, where I looked at Pakistan's most profound episode of trade liberalization, which started after Musharraf, 2001 onwards. Ishrat Hussain and others came on board and they tried to reduce tariffs. There was the liberalization of trade, but post-2008, you see the emergence of other types of trade barriers. So tariffs, the taxes on imports were coming down, but then regulatory duties were going up, non-tariff measures were going up. So there was a reversal of trade liberalization. And I studied through product level data, sector level data of which are the politically connected firms. There was a very interesting report called Who Owns Pakistan by Shahidul Rahman, who was a journalist, the kind of 42, 43 groups. And I looked at where those groups operate. And you find that in all those sectors where those groups operated, there was a reversal of trade liberalization, with the result that 2001, as the period of liberalization starts, even a shallow one, by 2021 we are back to the same level. Now, these groups are part of what I call the system of authoritarian power sharing. Whichever government comes in power, one of the members of these big business groups will be part of the cabinet. So it doesn't matter whether PMLN comes, whether PTI comes, whether People's Party comes, they will have their way. And the guys like our co-panelist here and his equivalents in the export sector, in the manufacturing sector, not in the service sector, but in the manufacturing sector, will not have a voice on the table. And so the entire equilibrium and trade policy is geared by those people. Doesn't matter which government comes on power. Now, what does this tell us? It tells us that we need to think beyond the civil-military divide. There is no civil-military divide in Pakistan when it comes to crucial economic questions. On sugar, they are all the same. On keeping development spending, they're all the same, whichever government comes to power. On keeping the tax system inefficient, they're all the same, right? Now, what we have instead is a system of authoritarian power sharing, where you have a few authoritarian principles behind the scenes. They have different partners who come in governments, and they have other types of partners in society, big businesses. That's why you see the army chief going to meet different business groups, because they're part of, it's part of the coalition. You have intellectuals like myself who are part of it, journalists who are part of it. And in that system of authoritarian power sharing, reform will only happen if those who have coercive power in society really, they realize, they recognize that it's time to change, right? Which in a sense on the IT sector, you could see that those who have coercive power are now realizing, well, maybe IT sector could be our savior. But there is another problem when it comes to those who hold coercive power. Those who hold coercive power have extremely short horizons. Think if you are the army chief, you have 3 years in front of you, and with the possibility of another 3 years. You know exactly what the tax problem is. You know exactly what needs to be fixed, at least your institution knows, where reform could come about. But you have very limited incentives to pursue it, because for the next 3 years, you will get some IMF program. you do consider yourself too big to fail, there would be some Gulf power that will come and save you, rescue you. You can use your links with Pentagon to get an IMF deal, and you will survive for the next 3 or 6 years. So what we are at the moment, we are passing through a stage where those who have real power to make decisions have extremely narrow horizons, 3 years. So think of it as a system of kingship where the king is only for 3 years. That's the worst type of kingship, because you could be Mohammed bin Salman, you could be another king, you could be the king of Morocco, you may not be democratic, but you realize you're going to be here for 20, 30 years, and it's in your interest. It's in the interest of your own institution, the monarchy, to implement reform. So I think we will be beating about the bush unless we talk about the real issues that this country faces, which is that with this system of authoritarian power sharing, unless there is a genuine pressure from outside powers to say, no, you've got to do the tax reform. Yes, the IMF chief says, Pakistan needs to implement taxes, but why don't they use their leverage? Because they are not using the true economic leverage, they're using the geopolitical leverage. That's why, whether it's Imran Khan or whether it's Shehbaz Sharif, they always say, well, it's the army chief that negotiated the IMF program, they facilitated the IMF program. How would an army chief facilitate an IMF program? He would obviously have to give some geopolitical concession. So this is a system of moral hazard, right? This whole idea of too big to fail. And to understand it, you have to look at countries like Egypt, right? When Sisi came in, in 2014, Egypt was indebted, $46 billion external debt. Today, Egypt's external debt is $146 billion. Just do the maths. $100 billion is the cost of sustaining authoritarian regime in Sisi. He has very limited incentive to reform. Unless the outside powers say, no, you've got to fix it, this system is not running, you've got to improve the tax system. They tie the hands of the rulers and do the commitment challenge. The problem in the context of Pakistan is that we are now passing through a very difficult geopolitical phase. There's a China-US competition. Global powers probably want to keep Pakistan in a stalemate, in a kind of stagnated equilibrium, where you have enough to survive, but you don't have enough money to use your strategic options. And that is a challenge, I think, that we need to broach. And ultimately, the question should be, how do we broach reform within those political economy constraints? Otherwise, 10 years later, we'll be talking about this issue as well. Sorry, I took far too long.
No, thank you. I think it was very wonderfully put, and you basically stole the words out of my mouth, because this is the very next thing that I was going to come at. And initially I started this conversation highlighting that we've intimately, very, very intimately, we flirted with the possibility of default. And I say that because in terms of economic fundamentals, there's no reason as to why we could have evaded it. And a lot of, on the other side of aisle, people who tend to argue, and maybe rightly so, that we would never reach that scenario is because of the fact that there are international political economy and geopolitical factors that tend to help Pakistan circumvent that very bleak scenario of defaulting on sovereign debt. And then you also highlighted miscued incentives, and it is without a doubt Pakistan is in the grip of elite capture. The status quo is so deeply embedded, to which the government, whichever the government is, tends to be party of. On that note, it's a good segue into the next question that I have for Mr. Zubair Umar, is the privatization agenda. According to the World Bank, the state-owned enterprises in Pakistan have been rated the worst in South Asia and one of the worst in the world. I have some numbers in front of me that highlight that Pakistani SOEs have cost the taxpayers over rupees 458 billion just to stay afloat. So rather than contributing to the economy, they've been draining the economy, they've been bleeding the resources out of the economy, and the brunt is being faced by the common man, the taxpayers. It's very evident. Institutions like the PIA, the Pakistan Steel Mills, the DISCOs, our energy distributors, they've all been operating in huge losses that have been subsidized by the government, which is already operating below par, is operating year on year on fiscal deficit. So despite being so obvious that the need is there, we don't see any tangible or effective movement towards privatization. You've been at the forefront. Why do you feel that is, and how can it be realized? What are the ingredients that will actually help that happen? Because I've literally, since I've been growing up, I've been hearing that PIA needs to be privatized, steel mill needs to be privatized, and I think now I'm growing old and it's still the same discussions that are happening. So why is that?
Okay, just a comment, I think, to reinforce the comment about elite capture and why we don't go for the reforms, the kind of reforms that everyone should understand or realize that it is fundamental to Pakistan's future. And it's about the masses and so on. My take, based on my insight, knowledge of the political system over the last 10, 11 years, is slightly different. We don't undertake, there is a lead capture, but I think 95% of the political class across all political parties actually do not understand the depth of the problem. This is also a reality, because we all sit and meet those people and dine out in places where everything is fine. Our children go to the best private schools in the world, ultimately coming to LSE and Harvard and Oxford and so on. So where's the problem? Actually, I am telling you, 95%, I mean, in a meeting more than once over the last couple of years, not more than once, it's about a dozen times, people call me inqilabi when I say that, say 40% of the population is below poverty line. The middle class has been absolutely bundled out. They can't have the kind of life that the middle class must have, and what it needs to take to get Pakistan out of this trap. So there is a lack of serious understanding. And that brings me to the question of privatization. The state institutions are in bad state. So there's no question about it. Back in 2013, when I was given this opportunity to head the privatization ministry, the problem was slightly less in terms of the losses and the liabilities that have mounted since then. But the problem was there. Back in 1990, first time Pakistan started its privatization program when Mia Nawaz Sharif became the Prime Minister for the first time, and set up the privatization commission. There was no such thing before that. And there was a realization that the state institutions, and as I came to know later on that the objective was to privatize, including PIA, within the 6 months in 1990. So here we are, 34 years on, we are still debating how to go about privatizing PIA. One reason that has been a limitation to the privatization process in Pakistan is the political will to implement that. Because selling anything is not a problem. I mean, you might not get a good price. The most important aspect surrounding privatization, not just in Pakistan, anywhere in the world, has been what to do with the labor, what to do with the employees of that institution. Because when you privatize, and I have seen it firsthand, the first requirement of any potential investor is, I am not going to take those 20,000 or 15,000 PIA employees. And it's not just about the quantity of the employees, because most often we tend to ignore the fact that they are not talking about whether PIA should have, if it is understood that PIA has, for example, a need for 10,000 employees, and we say we have 15,000, so we try to bring down to 10,000. The potential investors say, no, this is not the 10,000 that I want. I want quality 10,000. So it's not just the quantity of the employees, it's also the quality of the employees. So literally you have to do away with the entire lot, virtually. That has been the case. And that is the biggest political challenge, how to deal with the employees, how to manage the employees when you go about privatization. And that is why some of the political parties, and it's not a consensus shared by all political parties. The three main political parties, Pakistan Muslim League, Pakistan People's Party, and Tehreek-e-Insaf, only on paper, Pakistan Muslim League is the one which advocates for privatization. Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf had a completely different point of view, and which was part of their manifesto. They said they will set up what was supposed to be called Sarmaya Pakistan, which was on lines of Malaysian and Singapore model, where you take out all the state institutions out of the control of the ministry, put them under this new organization, Sarmaya Pakistan, restructure them, and they will start running. That was the idea. And they were anti-privatization. Pakistan People's Party has been anti-privatization all along, except for a brief period when Benazir Shahid came into power second time in 1993, because the privatization program was already undergoing a major focus, and she thought, although her father had nationalized, and here she was required to now denationalize or privatize, and as a great leader, she did say that it was good then, the nationalization, but now I think the world has moved out of that nationalization concept. The biggest is the political will. And this is what happened, if you allow me, that after a week when I was interested in this position, Mr. Nawaz Sharif did ask me whether I'll be able to undertake this task. There were about 60 or 70 institutions that we were to privatize during the 5 years that the mandate allowed us to. And we thought there is sufficient time. So I replied to the Prime Minister, there are two major elements to privatization. One is the professional nature of the process. It's highly professional. If someone is going from the private sector to government, and if there is one ministry that provides the highest level of professionalism, that is privatization, because you're dealing with IMF, World Bank, the global financial institutions as your financial advisors, the chartered accountancy firms, the law firms, the top leadership of the public sector enterprises. So you are, obviously you have to have chartered accountants and MBAs and all of those stuff. You then deal with all the exchanges like London Stock Exchange, New York Stock Exchange, Singapore, and so on and so forth. This is a highly professional work. And I told the Prime Minister, that task I will complete. You just allow me to hire some resources, and I will deliver you on that. The other thing, I will do a part of it politically, but when the moment of truth will come, then it will be your decision and not my decision. And he said, what will be that moment of truth? And I said, that moment of truth will be, we will be at the last stage, having completed the professional work, which is about 2 years or 2.5 years, where the global financial institutions like the top investment banks are working as financial advisors, doing due diligence of those entities like PIA and the steel mill and the distribution companies and others. They are all involved because they know exactly what they have done in Argentina or Switzerland or wherever they have had this experience. So the last stage is basically when the moment of truth, I told the Prime Minister, will be, for example, in case of PIA, when they will go on strike. And they will go on strike, realizing that now the moment of truth has come. If we don't protest now, this will be privatized and we will no longer be the employees, or at least most of us will not be retained. And some of the planes will be stranded in New York, or some in Athens or London and so on and so forth. All the employees will have a pen-down strike. And he said, okay. So I said, if you are ready to give me the commitment, then we start the process. Exactly that thing happened, that we came finally to that process, and this is October 2015, which is 2.5 years or so after we had come into power. And according to our plan, my plan, was to push the three major, as we call the elephants, Pakistan Steel Mill, PIA, and FASCO, which was the best of the distribution companies, to privatize. And we came to the last stage. And PIA did go on strike, FASCO employees did go on strike, and the work was paralyzed, and so on and so forth. And I have to bring some politics into it, as you say, political economy. And Mr. Imran Khan has been a major player in Pakistani politics, and he has more often, not his fault, but his opponents see him as someone who's disrupting the process. So he goes to PIA, and he calls the employees that we will not let this happen. He goes to steel mill, and actually there are videos which are available, and threatening that if this thing is done, so we'll go. The task which I always knew, the task of the government is to ensure that that thing is resolved. The political leadership is taken into confidence, and obviously, as much as possible, you take on board and tell them what is the other option. We have come at this last stage. Let PIA go. We have potential investors, Gulf Airline, Emirates, Qatar, Etihad, a Chinese airline, Qantas. And similarly, we had bids for Fasco and steel mill we had. And at that point in time, unfortunately, the government of the day decided to pull back.
Due to political.
And if those 3 entities obviously would not go, why would the other 8 distribution companies go?
Yeah.
So the challenge is even more serious today than it was because the losses have mounted.
Yeah.
It is far more difficult to sell that balance sheet of PIA today or of Pakistan Steel or of Fasco or of any bank for that matter. But for me, and I think there is a general sense, and I am happy to say that I have been talking to the other party, which is very relevant today, Pakistan People's Party. And in Bilawal Bhutto, I think they have distanced themselves from the policies of the past, and they do understand that privatization is the way forward for Pakistan. So let's hope and pray that we find enough buyers for those loss-making entities that we have, and we can push this agenda, which has obviously been a nightmare for Pakistan. And it's not just the loss-making, which is obviously a headache. It is also the quality or the lack of quality of service for the people of Pakistan, because they have a choice between flying PIA on the domestic airline with 3 other private airlines who are doing exceptionally well. They are producing profit, PIA is losing money, and on the international we have a lot of other options. So PIA obviously is literally, the other option that someone had suggested was, if you can't sell, just close them. Whatever debt they have, I mean, at least it stops here.
Yeah.
And then you can do whatever with it. So for me, it is the way forward. The most important thing is the political will. And hopefully we have a political environment where everyone at least understands that this is the way forward and there is no way that we can escape this and delay this process.
No, thank you. It's a very key point that you bring to the forefront, that it's not, I mean, it is political will from the government, but it's also about disruptive politics and divisive rhetoric, the populist notion that is often hijacked from the party that is sitting in the opposition. And it's not just one particular party, whosoever is in the opposition tends to hijack that narrative in order to build its populist base with the masses. And it's kind of unfortunate for Pakistan because it is contrary to the economic needs of the country at that time. So we've spoken about the weaknesses and challenges that the government tends to ensue quite deeply. But I would also like to shift the onus a bit on our social degeneration and, talking about social development, because this divisiveness is not just witnessed across political party lines, it's also been increasingly seen in the masses. There's polarization, the liberals against the conservatives, people from various parties, not parties, even if they align with the ideologies of a certain party, do not engage in meaningful discourse with the other, on various other measures of social development and degeneration that I would like to call it. We look at gender inequality, which is one of the worst in the world. Accessing, justice, again, one of the indicators point that it's one of the worst in the world. There's bonded labor, exploitative labor practices. So all in all, these are very key drivers. Like human capital is a key driver of economic growth. And Dr. Adil Malik, you've published a lot. You've studied these in quite detail, the social dynamics and how they hamper the economy. So looking at Pakistan now, not just from a political point of view, but from the social aspect and how the people are navigating through the society these days, do you find it disheartening? Are you worried how the society is shaping?
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Let me connect with the question here as well. Zubair Saab was absolutely right that when you're thinking about any type of economic reform, if you haven't done a political economy homework, that means you're not serious. Because, I'm talking about the governments in general. Because reform is not a part-time process. I'll give you 2 very quick examples. In Turkey, Turgut Özal, when he implemented that massive reform program, their auto sector was extremely protective, and they resisted. He had to go, just count the number of meetings he had with the auto sector, with their employees, gave them 6 years, that this would be a sunset clause. After 6 years, things will change. created a transition plan, created a buyout with different actors. In our country, leaders are just pursuing this on a part-time basis. Iran is another example. It is so hard, more than privatization, the reform of the subsidy system. If you're an oil-rich country and your populations are hooked on, cheap gas and fuel, it's very, very hard. It's politically more emotive than privatization. Now, what he did was to announce that we are going to implement cash transfer program because these subsidies are benefiting the rich people more than the poor, and we'll have these direct cash transfers given to them. Now, they made sure that an account was open for every individual in Iran, and when the parliament broaches that question of reform and passes the legislation, on the same day in the morning, everybody has received the first cash transfer. Right? So they kind of solved that commitment challenge. And in all the MENA countries, Middle East, North African countries, Iran's reform on subsidy reform was truly dramatic. So I think you need to think about political economy questions. Otherwise, reform is very hard. Now, the question about social degeneration and other problems, there are lots and lots of problems at the moment in Pakistan, right? And there, of course, we are talking about a country that has one of the largest populations of out-of-school children in the world. There is growing polarization. There's a shrinking resource pie, right? There's much less money to go to satisfy different elites. So you have to use more and more repression in years to come. Unless we solve our economic problems, we have to use more repression to keep the same status quo. Now, in that context, I think the fundamental challenge that we are facing today is the breakdown of institutions of conflict management. As a social scientist, I find it extremely problematic that much of the media discourse over the last, 4 or 5 months has been dominated by just 9 May, thinking of it just in sort of media terms. As a social scientist, I can tell you, you look at civil insurgencies in Africa, in Latin America, other places, there is one simple lesson, which is that sovereignty contesting forms of violence, where you rise against the state, sovereignty contesting forms of violence always arises when there is a breakdown in the institutions of conflict management, when you are unable to channelize grievances. Now, if you control the media, if you control the judiciary, if you control all avenues through which you could channelize these grievances, you could create those institutions of conflict management, you are actually inviting sovereignty contesting forms of violence. And this is true today. This morning when I was looking at Twitter, all these attacks you had in Balochistan. There are people who are BLA fighters who are being buried with flowers, and people are, raising freedom slogans. And the central state is what it is doing, it's debating iddat and nikah. It's shameful, absolutely shameful. So I think the whole idea, the two submissions that I would like to make, the whole point about civil-military divide is gone. There is no civil-military divide. This is a system of authoritarian power sharing where people like myself, the intellectuals, the media, the judiciary, the big business, they are part of that system of authoritarian power sharing. And it's the insight that comes also from people like Bruno de Mesquita, who talked about the dictator's handbook. He said, dictator is never solo rule. It's always joint rule. So I think we've come to a stage in life where we have to recognize who is an ally of the system, silently or in the front. That's one. The second submission I want to make is that we are, we used to talk in the 80s and 90s when I was growing up, all intellectuals, liberals, they used to talk about civil-military divide, civil-military relations are very problematic, I think we've now come to a stage where we should talk about state-society relationship. The citizens' trust in main state institutions is going. Right? Now, when we talk about terrorists use coercion without any legitimacy. What is the police doing? What is the election commission doing at the moment? What is the state doing? It is acting like a terrorist. So we are passing through a very difficult situation where we should be worried about state-society relationship, because we've come to a point where citizens' trust in the state has really declined, and there's only two ways out. Either we go more towards civil war, if these institutions of conflict management completely crumble down, or there has to be some reform, some way where we can constrain, we can shackle the Leviathan. How can we shackle the Leviathan should be the real question.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for really pointing that out. And Hamza, like after this discussion, would you want to revise your outlook that you initially shared?
No, I think I would double down on it because I have to compensate for all the negativity. And look, I think all of that is valid. Everything that we're talking about is extremely valid. Till we don't address the issues, we won't be able to solve the issues. But at the same time, I would again urge the fact that despite all of this, India exports more IT services than Saudi exports oil. More than $100 billion worth of IT export in India. We are right now at $3 billion in Pakistan. And we produce about 20,000 computer graduates every single year. And like I said, all they need is a laptop, an internet connection, and the ability to write code. And we can sell software just like India does. Because we have so many people, I think that's one of a saving grace this industry could be for the country because it doesn't need much to prosper. But at the same time, I would tell you, to echo some of the stuff that's been said, over the past 4 years, I have about 30 foreign investors in Bazar who've put millions of dollars in the company. At no point are they ever bothered by anything that goes on in the country, whether it's assassinations, whether it's bomb blasts, whether it's protests. The only point where I get concerning messages whenever a Wall Street Journal headline goes that Pakistan internet was shut down for 2 days. Because my entire business is dependent on that. And then they say, okay, how can a Cisco or a Google or a Microsoft or any tech company within Pakistan prosper if the state shuts down the internet? And we're hearing that before the election as well, we're expected to maybe shut down the internet. And I'm thinking about how my business is going to run for those days. So like I said, the only thing my industry needs is the state to just leave us alone. And we will be fine. And there is so much to be hopeful for. If you come down to, let's say, Islamabad or Peshawar or Lahore, a Kiryana store, in my business digitizes Kiryana stores across the country. A Kiryana store in Tarnaul or Sheikhupura or Khanewal is more digitized than the off-license or a grocery store in London. Because they have a very cheap 4G internet and smartphone connection, they are online, they are on YouTube, they are on WhatsApp, and what we did was just created a simple Android application so they can order dal, chawal, atta, chini, all the stuff they sell at their store, and get credit against it as well. And they've jumped onto the platform. It's just taken us 4 years, but most retailers in Pakistan are on the Bazar application buying stuff. So there is still a lot to do despite all of this. And my submission again would be, after all of the stuff that's talked about, that it is still an extremely large market. It might be growing at 2%, but it's still a $350 billion GDP economy, formal and informal. I think it's probably 2x that. It remains to be digitized. We have the talent available. There is no competition. India, for example, suffers from a lot of competition. Even if a tech company comes into India, there's 5 others who are funded even better. In Pakistan, if you're one company, if you can get the talent and the capital, you can really do extremely well. So whether it's financial services, education, healthcare, logistics, it is a very, very large economy. If, like I said, there are 2-3 years of stability, I'm extremely hopeful that this industry at least can do well despite all that goes on.
Please.
So I would just like to add to this and say that whatever I said in a way is very bleak, but it's also very optimistic, because whenever you have moments of crisis, there are moments of opportunity, right? It's a stage where institutions are in the works, right? In this country, without the glorious revolution, there was no rule of law, right? And a lot of other Middle Eastern countries that I study, Tunisia, Egypt, Algeria, I'm more optimistic about Pakistan than Egypt, right? In part because there is real fire under the feet of the ruler, right? There is more contestation of power. And of course, it could go into many different directions, but there's more contestation and there's a youth bulge. It's the writing is on the wall. People are not buying the narrative of the state. They want change. They don't have the idea for what change would look like, but they're really fed up with the old order. So that's all very positive, because it's kind of, even in economics, we talk about creative destruction, some of this destruction that we're seeing would be very creative.
No, I would definitely second.
The reason why I think, because I feel I have no choice. We are born Pakistani, whether we get a British passport or an American passport, or we see in the UAE or the Saudi. We cannot, even if we want to escape our identity, we will always be a British Pakistani, or American Pakistani, or a Middle Eastern resident. So this identity we take with us everywhere. And I think over the past 2 months or 3 months, all of the Palestine crisis that we saw, we see this a lot of bias that the world will not let you forget who you are. You are from a country, you are brown-skinned, and you will always disagree with the policies of the governments in the countries that we reside in, which are not Pakistan. And so, despite everything, we need the stories. We need our own stories. We need to develop our own economy. We need to come back, and we will always be at conflict, whether we get a finance job in London or any other public sector job in the Middle East. We will always dispute the policies in those countries, and we'll always be at this contradiction on a daily basis. And so I think after taking all of the experience in life insurance that we did after the degrees and jobs that we do, I think we have the responsibility to go back and start our own stories in our own country. And only through that are we able to sort of create that center of power and make our country do better despite all of the challenges, because we have no other choice. We cannot escape the identity whether we like it or not.
Thank you. I would like to mimic and second all of what you've shared. And like we initially started, that the point is not to criticize Pakistan, but if you want to kind of curate the way forward, you actually need to go back and realize where the key issues lie. And that is actually just like a sort of introspection into where the opportunities are. Otherwise, everything's futile. You don't know what's the right silver bullet. And before I open it up to the audience, I just want to add one other particular thing, that while we talk about reform agendas, we talk about privatization, we talk about private sector development, we need to keep the human in the center of the policy. We have to create human-centric policies and ensure that if we are able to generate greater revenue in taxation, it is being allocated towards development-oriented goals and objectives. Otherwise, it is futile. And likewise, if we're able to prop up the private sector, there's a responsibility of the private sector to ensure that it does not underemploy. Unemployment is another issue, but like underemployment is when the market is not, remunerating you for the right capabilities, what your market wages are. There's no exploitation. There are inclusive practices which tend to, encourage women to be part of the economy as well. So there's a responsibility of the private sector as well, because the brain drain that we see happening in Pakistan is because of the fact that people feel that they're not being rightly compensated by the private sector in Pakistan, and thus they tend to move abroad. So, there's equal responsibility that needs to be shared by the government, by the masses, and also by the private sector. We need that social cohesion. And on that note, I would like to open it up for questions from the audience. Please state your name, your question, and who you want it to be addressed with. You raised your hand first, so please.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm Ibrahim Altaf. I've come from Pakistan, so I've this question to these prestigious economists. Am I audible?
Yes, okay, it'll be easier if you can specify who the question is for.
You're an economist, and Dr. Akil, you're an economist. So my question is preferable to you guys. How our economy sustain at 22% discount rate? For example, we've been financing our fiscal deficit, which has soared enormously after our discount rate has reached 22%. We are just fueling inflation, which is about to come in next 1 or 2 years. I think 1 year has passed by with the discount rate at 22%. And a year later, we'll be facing the inflation which has been created by 22% discount rate. So if we cut that down, we can save that inflation which we are going to face in years coming by. So the argument that comes in favor of a higher discount rate is that we cut down the imports. We try to control the import bill. But we've seen that in the past 1 year that Pakistan has administratively managed to control the imports. We've been right now, Sagdar was criticized for that he's been controlling imports administratively, but the caretaker finance minister is also doing that, and our imports are at $4.6 or $4.8 billion each month. So we're still doing that under an IMF program. So what if we cut that down? And if you allow me, I have a second question to as well.
We'll just keep it to one per person, if that's okay.
If you don't mind.
We can only answer one, but yes, you can.
The second one is a little slighter different, but that is what I think, that if we try to cash subsidize our exporters, because our exporters do not have that potential to export and increase our export from $30 billion to $45 billion or $50 billion. But if we try to eliminate their international differential from directly giving them the cash, so I think I haven't done any research about that, but that is what I think. We can substantially increase our exports, and the money which we pay just to save, just to finance our government at 22%, that money we can, if we put it in exporters basket, that is subsidy, which everyone oppose, but we can raise our dollar earning, which it's a working capital investment. We'll only invest in 1 year for 1 year, and then we'll roll over for the years to come by.
The question is clear.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think very briefly, when you think about the discount rate, again, it's a very proximate factor. Obviously, you have pressure from the IMF to increase the cost of borrowing because the primary source is the government. And in fact, at this moment, the net credit to the private sector is negative. You know, that really says something. So you really have to reform, just tinkering on the margins would not do. Same for exports. When you think about the export finance schemes, export reimbursement schemes, I had a colleague at the World Bank, Gonzalo, who was working on trade, and he was, the bankers cannot say that, the World Bank cannot say that, but he was saying there's a lot of political influence, particular kinds of lobbies that benefit from the way we finance and reimburse our exporters. The technical fix is not that difficult, but you've just got to create a situation where those in power would, really need to fix that, and they have the incentive to do that.
The only thing that I'd like to add, I mean, your concern is valid. I mean, 22% policy rate is unsustainable for businesses. And if the businesses don't grow, the country does not grow. So you have to have a balance between keeping an eye on the inflation, which is coming down, which is obviously expected to further come down. But this time there was an expectation that the policy rate will be dropped in line with what has been happening in the market. But I think they have kept it at the same rate. By the time the next monetary policy comes in March, the new government will be in power, and I think they would like to take the benefit of reducing the rate.
Yeah. Please, I'm really sorry. No, we have to give everyone the chance, and in order to respond to the. Yes, please.
Can I go? Assalamu alaikum. Khurram Iqbal. My question is to Zubair Umar Saab. I actually, obviously, it's so nice of you to explain the privatization process.
Thoda sa uncha bolenge.
So nice of you to explain the whole privatization process. And I know obviously it's been going on since I was growing up as well in 90s. But the main thing is actually, the question is that you have been given a problem and you have to resolve a problem. Whether it's actually you or your team or the whole government, is it that hard to solve the problem for so many years? I mean, the solution is not just only to privatization. Solution is to actually find out the best way forward, right? And as Adil Saab mentioned as well, why do we actually go for 2 years or 3 years and then give up? It's like actually the army is gone to solve a problem, and when they see the mob in front of them, and they just back off and then forget about it for the next 3 years, and then come back again and then start the same process, 2 years, and financial institution, everything has come up, and then again, everything is switched off. So why don't we actually continue? Or if you think actually we need some stakeholders, the main key stakeholders in Pakistan, and sit down first and find it out, do we want to solve this problem? It could be
I get
actually
your point.
Transition,
I
talking to
think I
the,
can start
talking
to
to
answer
the
that.
staff and this and that.
I think in this room, people have to also understand what I pointed out. There are 3 major political parties, 2 are against privatization, as per their stated policies. And I don't think so those who overwhelmingly support a party, but still call that state institutions must be fixed, have forgotten that commitment that we don't want to go for privatization. That's the stance of PTI and People's Party. So when you are in politics and in the government, you need to have a conducive environment. I'm not saying what your initial point was, that the responsibility is on the party which says that we want to privatize and still does not end up privatization, and that's the responsibility that I own, that failure that I own on behalf of the party, but I explained the reasons. I think this is time for major political parties, and I have personally tried to go to the other political parties and question and ask them for an alternate solution to fix this thing. You can't just say that we don't want privatization, but you expect PIA to start becoming profitable. It's not happening. Pakistan Steel is closed for 8.5 years, almost 9 years closed. We're still dishing out money to the employees who are sitting there. So if that is the state of affairs, and there are other institutions who are also responsible, because the start was by Chief Justice Iftikhar Chaudhry, because it's important to mention here the damage that was done. Pakistan Steel was privatized in 2006. It had a very good price considering the state of affairs, and it was undone. It was not just the reversal of Pakistan Steel Mills privatization, but it was the reversal of our entire privatization program, which stood at a standstill for the next following 8 years. Nothing happened. And no financial institutions was ready, global financial institution was ready to participate in the process. That includes Citibank, which was the financial advisor in that original steel mill case, Merrill Lynch or Bank of America or Credit Suisse. They were literally saying, we are done with Pakistan. So Pakistani leadership, all institutions must also recognize that when populist decisions are taken, how much damage it is done to the country for a sustained period of time before you can convince others, no, this time we are serious, this time we want to undergo. But yes, the responsibility rests with whichever party commits to do and then fails to do it. I think this is now the following 5 years will test the will of the next government.
Yeah, and before that, actually, I just wanted to get back to the question about export. I think it's a very key economic question. My personal take is that I'm not a big fan of subsidies, and I say that because in doing so, the government is always either picking winners or losers. You know, the government deciding which particular sector to spur up. But if it's only get rid of the regulation and let the market play out, you know, that's where the competitive advantage thing comes in, kicks in. You know, and if you're trying to handhold a particular sector, that means it's not really competitively. It's not that profound. So, and the other thing about, you know, rather than paying 22%, why are they not like giving that money towards subsidizing? We're already operating in fiscal. So our fiscal deficits are like 8%. So we're already in the negative. We don't really have that kind of money that we can continue to subsidize other entities. So that is that. And yes, Alim, you have a question. And please, I would request everyone to keep the questions brief.
Yeah, of course. So my question is very short, but my question is to Governor Saab. So we have Hamza here, who represents a newer way of thinking, and which is probably more in line with what India is kind of undergoing right now. So my question is, does the political class of Pakistan have that appreciation for those newer ways of thinking, which are required to survive in the current world, especially when value creation comes from venture capital, comes from startups, comes from new ideas? So essentially, does the political class have enough of an appreciation for those models? And if not, what must it do, or what must the private sector do to bring that sort of appreciation?
Political class.
The question is for me? Okay, I mean, whether the government of the day, I mean, because we are talking about a caretaker government, so I actually don't know, except for the fact that Mr. Umar Saif, who is the IT minister, has better understanding than most of the other or former ministers who have been in governments over the last few years. Whether Mr. Umar Saif will be there or not, because that will be a major loss for Pakistan as far as I am concerned. There is not much appreciation, I can tell you. And that also reinforces my statement that whether the political class across all political parties does it have the serious understanding of the depth of the problem? I mean, encouraging entities, the startups and so on and so forth, the kind of support that they need. I don't think so they have had that support. And the success that they have enjoyed despite bad economic conditions, bad political conditions, and the emphasis that he has made repeatedly that there is such a potential for going up. And I think I will take this message, by the way, and pass it on to those who hopefully who come into power post February 8th, that this is an area that we need to encourage.
Thank you. Yes, please. Sorry, he's going to get your mic.
Hello, hi. My name is Dr. Yasmin Hasnain. I'm an emergency medicine consultant in the NHS for 33 years. And I have been working with emergency medical systems in Bannoor, KPK, since 2015. So I do have, a bit of an eye of what's, the differences between in here and there. One thing I want to say to all these young people is, you've heard a lot of capitalistic talk here. The question you need to ask is, why is the NHS not privatized? Why does this country, every person in this country, fight for the NHS to survive? Because when you privatize something which is a state institution, which might be doing a lot of good, if you privatize it, the inequality of care, inequality of access to that system comes into play. Okay, so just remember that. When these guys are talking about privatization, just remember they're going to be shareholders, they're going to be people making a lot of money, and a lot of people not getting the service that they deserve. My question is, and it's to Hamza, telehealthcare in Pakistan, it's a huge opportunity. The growth rate is predicted to be 8% in the next 5 years. At an 8% growth, I think they're saying about it's worth about $500 million at the moment. And it has huge opportunities for Pakistan. It will be able to get healthcare to remote areas in Pakistan. It will be able to bring international healthcare workers to give health advice to people in Pakistan, and it will be able to actually make creative solutions. So, the whole PPG technology that we're using in health, like, with the sensors, you can do blood pressure, you can do sugar, you can do so many assessments, right? That can be done in a much more creative, much more efficient manner than what the NHS or what the American health system delivers. So what's your view on that? Thank you.
I think there's a lot of exciting work happening at the ground stage in telehealth. So there are a couple of companies called Sehat Khani, there is a company called Marham, and what they've just started to do is a lot of medical graduates in Pakistan, especially female medical graduates, they graduate out of medical college and they get married, and then they are not very productive of their degree. So what they're doing is they're connecting those doctors who are trained doctors with the mass market, and bringing both the cost down and then making all of those qualified doctors a lot more productive. So yes, I think there's a lot of stuff happening. I think the only thing, the challenge right now is availability of initial capital for companies to start, because initially all tech companies are loss-making and they need equity injection to start. There are a few venture capital firms in Pakistan who can give you the initial funding, so about $1 million, $2 million. But beyond that, when you really want to scale to a large market, you are dependent on foreign capital. Now, the challenge with foreign capital right now in Pakistan is that when Bazar raised funding, we were at 170 to $1 in terms of PKR to USD. Now we're at 280. And the international investors are always thinking about the dollarized returns, and when there's devaluation, they don't factor that into that. 2000 to 2020, Pakistan's average devaluation was 5 to 6%, and you could always bake that into investment thesis. But 2022 to 2023 was a complete shambles, and so that is the conception that we have to change. So, like I said, 2-3 years of currency stabilization will yield more investment into tech sector, and telehealth remains one of the largest, most exciting sectors to be digitized in Pakistan today, because we have a lot of people and they have a lot of health issues, and technology can solve that. With AI as well, there's a lot of AI solutions that is bringing the cost of healthcare down significantly, and so the health equality that you talked about, technology can play a huge part in bringing that into Pakistan.
Thank you, Hamza, and thank you for raising the question. I think in the interest of time, we'll have to now end the discussion. And I'd like to again thank our panelists for a very insightful and stimulating discussion. It was an absolute pleasure having you and engaging in this discourse.
Thank you, Norris, and thank you to the audience for your questions. That brings us to the end of our second session. Thank you to our speakers, Professor Malik, Hamza, and Norris, for their invaluable insights. Today's discussion highlighted the shortcomings of Pakistan's past economic policies, as well as outlining a vision for a future of economic security and progress. It was particularly enlightening to have an industry perspective to join the discussion this year as well. We will now break for a brief intermission before introducing our final session. To those returning for our next session, please make sure that you have the appropriate wristbands and try to exit from the left. Thank you so much.